The thing that's hard to capture in these automated benchmarks is this back and forth that happens in real world environments and the diversity of those real world environments. If you probably inspected the coding agents of the companies that people know about today, they would find there's a lot less deviation than you'd expect on the actual agent. And the vast majority of the deviation comes from product decisions about where on the cost quality Pareto frontier to sit and what integrations and context they use.
Hello everyone and welcome to a new episode of AI Without Borders. I'm thrilled to have Eno Reyes, co-founder of Factory AI. Factory aims to bring autonomy to software development. They have raised over 20 million from funds like Sequoia and Lux Capital and is trusted by teams at companies like Zapier and Build. But most importantly for this podcast, Eno's family has deep roots in Mexico. Eno, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat today.
So starting from the beginning, your family originally migrated from Mexico, and I've heard they started a Mexican restaurant in Los Altos. How much did that immigrant background influence your entrepreneurial spirit and your journey that led at the end to founding Factory?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is a just very clear relationship between when my abuelo, when he came, his whole family has like doctors and lawyers, same with my abuela. But when they came to the United States, they moved to San Francisco and, they had to kind of pick up sort of different roles when they first arrived. Very quickly, they were able to, find community and find a lot of opportunity. And I think that the interesting thing is that they were very willing to, it's something we actually say at Factory, like kind of like pick up the trash, so to speak, of, if you are, there's a lot of people that would maybe come to a place and be sort of like, hey, like I'm above this, but ultimately they picked up work that was definitely not necessarily flashy. And so I think it was the entrepreneurial spirit that they had to start this restaurant, to go and find a place to sort of bring some of their culture and find community there that ultimately set in stone. My father was also very entrepreneurial. He had growing up, he was fascinated by computers. There's sort of a story when he was in San Francisco, he got into an accident, was on crutches in the 70s, 80s, like being on crutches. There's only like one major opportunity there, and it's to like look at sort of this evolving world of computers. So he's involved very heavily in this, despite maybe a lot of his peers not necessarily kind of seeing that vision. And I think similarly with my mother, who she's adopted, so we actually don't have like a clear trace of exactly where she's from. But I think the two of them, both my parents, really instilled in me a certain mentality about what it means to build. I think we all sort of owe to not just ourselves, but to the world. The opportunities afforded to us can be multiplied and then shared back. And I think that that's like a big driver of our philosophy of thinking about what it means to live in, for example, a world of totally abundant software, where people who may not have had the education, the background, or the specific college pedigree to build something, but still have that same capacity, that same capability. I think democratizing access to that is essentially the like core motivator of building something like Factory.
I absolutely love that. My father has a similar story, and you kind of feel that responsibility. If they did all of that and went through all of that, like they have to deliver.
It's totally true. And my co-founder, Matan, his parents are also immigrants that came here, same vision, right? To build a better life for themselves and for their children. And I think that, I'm definitely incredibly privileged to be able to live in the same city, right? And I think coming back, I also think that just building here in San Francisco is this sort of like exciting sort of circling back to that initial time. So it's great. It's really exciting.
No, I appreciate you sharing that story and going through the theme of the moment. How did you got exposed to the world of AI?
My father was obsessed with technology and progress and growth. And I think that, and my mother as well, they're both actually artists. So they both went to art school in their own forms, like digital media, illustration. I think that they wanted to explore a lot of the themes of progress and technology. And I think that through that, one of the obvious themes of like both the art side of things and the cultural side of progress is this idea of technology and intelligence and computing. So from very, very early on, I was exposed to a lot of these ideas. And I think that blending that with when I went to school, I was very interested in neuroscience and cognitive science. And so it was a very natural blend that I became pretty obsessed with this idea of like the computational models of cognition that might exist. Like, how can we build systems that more closely resemble the way that humans think? And so I think that was really the path that occurred, is almost like going from the art side of things to the like sciences.
No, and we'll get later deeper into how that philosophy shapes how you thought about Factory. But starting from the beginning of Factory, one of the things that I've been fascinated about your story is how quickly you and Matan decided to work together. So I know that you had studied at Princeton. Both of you had a lot of mutuals together, but never spoke, and then met at a hackathon. And then after a couple days, decided to start working together. As you know, and as they said, like, this is a marriage or even more than a marriage. And I was just so curious to ask you, like, what at the time, what was the thought process, or how did you know that kind of Matan was the one that you wanted to build a company, and was there the right mixture so fast, especially?
Matan sometimes uses the phrase intellectual love at first sight, which I think is totally apt. I think that there's a couple of things. One, in undergrad, we kind of knew of each other. It's the type of thing where you're passing by somebody and you like say hi because you have a bunch of mutual friends. But we had never really had the opportunity to one-on-one chat and like kind of get a sense of each other. When we first met, I think call it the energy in the air from, this was like very, very early on when there were tons of these events in San Francisco. It felt like AI was starting to make a real step function change in capability. And so there was sort of an energy in the air of like, now's the time to build. And so I think you blend that with then when we met, we started talking, and, effectively we just never stopped talking. To this day, we still haven't stopped talking to each other. And I think that basically every day for the last 2.5 years. And I think that part of that comes from this sort of shared desire to bring the mission of our company, right? We always talk about bringing autonomy to software engineering. I think that going back to what I said earlier, just this idea of an abundance of software, unlocking massive gains of productivity for human beings, massive welfare improvements for humans. I think that that's such a clear opportunity for the world to be a better place. And then you combine that with the, of course, fascinating intellectual challenge of making this happen. He's a physicist, I'm obsessed with brains. I think that this is a very natural sort of pairing. And of course, because of our mutual friends, we were able to pretty quickly, know that one another would be a good fit. So I think that that's kind of how that ended up rolling out. But I'm very, very grateful that we were lucky enough to have that like serendipitous moment.
Yeah, I'm curious, did you run one of those kind of founder questionnaires, or it led more naturally?
It was pretty informal. I would say that it kind of arose out of, we definitely had a lot of serious conversations about the commitment and about what we were getting ourselves into. Maybe it was a little rash as well that we like, he dropped out. I quit my job like basically 8 days after we first met. But I think at the end of the day, sometimes you do have to kind of just make a risky, bold bet. And we were both able to do that, and it worked out.
Yeah, no, the founder path many times is doing the non-rational things that make it work. And going out to Factory, maybe for those who are not familiar, if you can share a brief description of what Factory is and how it is maybe different from like Cursor or Devin, and your perspective on the agent-driven development.
So for those who aren't familiar, Factory, we are basically building a platform that allows you to delegate tasks entirely to agents that we call droids, and in particular, software development tasks. And so we don't say coding very specifically because we believe in, as you mentioned, this concept of agent-driven development, where there's a whole lot of work that as a software developer, you're responsible for driving from start to finish, right? It's coding, of course, but it's also ideation and spec writing. It's incident response and reliability work. It's documentation, technical writing, testing. All of these processes are ultimately benefit from a sort of like shared engineering system understanding that you build. But it seems like most of the products in market today are really focused on accelerating coding specifically. And so what we did was we built a platform that lets the agents do far more than that and then hooks it up to enterprise context. So rather than trying to fiddle with different like MCPs or copying and pasting data from all over, you can really actually connect everything in a secure way and then deploy a more centralized agent experience that allows your whole team to learn and share insights across the agents as they work. So in many ways, I would say that compared to like a Devin or a Cursor, our system is very enterprise focused and learns and grows with your org in a way that you think is pretty unique to our product.
That's super disruptive. And one of the things I wanted to get your take on is how do you balance disruption and autonomy? And I know you sometimes mention the analogy of the car and the horse, but how do you enable new experience and a new way of doing things while at the same time meeting people and companies where they are today and what they're comfortable with today?
This is a great question because I think that there's sort of always this tension between like meeting people where they are and creating a newer or disruptive workflow. I think there is this sort of need to currently unlock mindshare and opportunity and show people what's possible. And to do that, you do have to build surfaces that interface with existing tools, right? So for that reason, we have our web interface. We have interfaces in Slack and Jira and Linear. We're working on shipping a couple more of these basically like access points to the agents across your existing tools, right? And we have those so that as a user, you can stay within a certain set of like known interfaces. Now, that being said, the moment that you start using these tools, and depending on which surface you're actually using it from, you sort of have a different intent and you start to realize what's possible, right? If you are interacting with an agent from Slack, then that is very much a delegation style flow, right? You're not going to have like really detailed interactions with an agent inside of Slack. You need a much more complex interface to really use that, like an IDE or a web-based interface. But the moment that you start to understand what it means to really delegate your work instead of merely collaborating with AI, that's when you sort of unlock this broader set of speed ups. And that requires the workflow shift. And we have the tools and the interfaces in place such that as you realize that, you can start to shift towards the newer interfaces and really realize, oh, wow, I could, instead of maybe getting 30% faster, I could be 5 to 10 times faster. And so it's kind of like basically building a ramp towards that ultimate realization of there's a new workflow at the end of the rainbow. And then a lot of our products, in many ways, our job is to guide you from start to finish and help enterprises navigate that transition.
And maybe double clicking on that ramp, especially as you go towards enterprises, the trust factor is very important and that's something that you likely start gaining over time. How do you think that maybe as it relates to that ramp that you were mentioning?
So I would say that probably the biggest product principle that we have is to earn the right. And what that means, like more grounded to our product, is we think that you have to earn the right to provide these sorts of agents and services and be the sort of beacon of what agent-driven transformation looks like. And you earn that right by building trust, right? And so in particular, what we found is that building out sort of a proactive set of policies and ideas about what safe and responsible autonomy looks like is basically the only way that you can really win this trust, right? So you kind of have to go through this process of saying, let's define what frontier agentic capabilities actually look like, right? They're systems that autonomously write or modify substantial volumes of code or services, right? They have access or even manage production code and production environments, and they can deploy these changes across different environments. If a system can do those things, then we're talking about the very frontier of autonomy, right? And so you sort of can build out this framework for identifying risk, evaluating it, mitigating those risks, and monitoring those mitigations. And if you can do that systematically, then you basically have this way of saying, okay, let's just think about, for example, to ground this in like very practical examples. How do we protect against data exfiltration? Well, we know that AI can inadvertently expose secrets, sensitive logs, internal data. So we need to implement some sort of pattern detection for that type of exfiltration. We need to have content filtering that looks for secrets or API keys. And we know LLMs are going to do this, so we have to build that, right? And then we show our users. Similarly, like destructive actions, or like risky actions that an agent may take. You need your agent to be able to run like a remove command in order for it to be productive. But a remove command on the base root of your file system is obviously incredibly high risk. And there's no LLM in the world that's frontier that won't at least recognize what a risky action is. So you can build this sort of like analysis that where the LLM says, hey, by the way, this actually seems pretty risky. And then you can build controls in such that an org can say, well, I only want like medium risk actions to be taken autonomously, or I have no tolerance for risk. I need to manually approve every single action. So these sorts of UX patterns can only come from that previous like sort of identify, evaluate, mitigate, and monitor loop. And our team is basically just red teaming and doing this at all times, especially every time we're about to ship a sort of like net new capability.
No, it sounds like a very robust platform. And you're mentioning something earlier in your answer about gaining the right to in their customer case. I was hearing an old podcast you did, I think like about a year ago, where they asked you about fine tuning, and you were mentioning like, well, I think you have to gain the right to do fine tuning. Two questions as it relates to that. Do you think at this stage, have you gained that right to do fine tuning? And second, which actually may be even the bigger question, what's your perspective on fine tuning? As I know the space has kind of come and go on opinions if it's worth it or not.
Yeah, totally. I think that definitely this space is constantly evolving. And I do think that basically the sort of reason why you would fine tune at this point is for cost efficiency or for an area where a marginal gain in performance is meaningful in your sort of like end product. So an example of this might be fast file editing, right? This is something that a lot of people have built sort of fine-tuned models or done additional post-training on models to make sure that when you edit a code file, that it happens as quickly as possible and as accurately as possible. When you're running, let's say, 1 to 5 million edits a day, a 1% additional gain in error rate is like meaningful. That's the difference between a couple of customers churning. And so I think that there's a real world where fine tuning these very domain specific tasks is high reward. But I also think that there's a whole other set of folks who, especially in the code gen space, have picked up like larger teams to work on like full model building, like a full post-training process to dedicate towards software LLMs. We're still bearish on this approach in general. I think that the outwardly you'll say that this is to push the frontier, but inwardly it's, it is a cost reduction sort of effort, right? Like you're spending a lot of money on Anthropic or Google or OpenAI's models, and all you really need to do is match the parity or be within a certain standard deviation of those models at a tenth of the price, and that makes a lot more sense. I think that externally, though, you may communicate this in order to recruit talent. Realistically, it seems like the biggest barrier to building a better coding model are a combination of long context and compute and like post-training data. And these things, I think, are really difficult without huge volumes of money. And I'm talking not about like 100 million. I'm not talking about even 1 billion. I'm talking about 10 plus billion in cash just to buy the sort of compute and data needed to really compete at the frontier. And so it just feels like rather unlikely that as a startup, that's a game we want to be playing.
No, that's interesting, because the other part that I was hearing that you shared was that you had developed some interesting technique to generate many things in parallel that would accelerate things, but it was like cost prohibited. And beyond coding, I don't know if you have an advice or framework you can give to founders as it respect to that. They say like build thinking about the next generation of models at the foundational layer, but there's a balance in like what do you wait for and how long it will take to get to the point that you likely need it. And
yeah, it's a great question. I think it's probably best said that you should be building for the next generation of models, and you should be building for the next generation of the most models. So, for example, Claude 4 Opus, O3 on high reasoning, Gemini 2.5 Pro, these sorts of models are, this sort of Pareto frontier, they're pretty high on the cost function but also high on the quality. I think you should generally assume that those models will fall down to be extremely cost efficient in less than a year. And so you should really think, okay, whatever thing that runs at 50% accuracy or 60% accuracy, if it ran last model at 20% accuracy, it's probably going to get 100% nailed in the next wave of frontier models. And then one generation after that, that performance will be very cheap. And so if you're not sort of building for this idea that models will get better, context lengths will increase, and the speed of like the balanced quality cost models will increase, then you're sort of almost building like in the past. And one sort of trap that I've seen are people who are earlier stage building products that kind of assume some sort of stagnation in the quality of the models, right? And I think that honestly, a lot of even like agent companies, including ourselves, when we were very early on, spent a lot of our time on sort of the architecture of the agent. And it's like partly correct because now there's a lot related to making sure that you can handle multiple LLM providers and reliable tool use. And I think a lot of that stuff is still valuable, but there's a whole lot of other stuff in the cognitive architectures that ended up, effectively not being very helpful. I think that if you probably inspected the coding agents of the bulk of the companies that people know about today, they would find there's a lot less deviation than you'd expect on the actual agent. And the vast majority of the deviation comes from like real, like sort of product decisions about where on the cost quality Pareto frontier to sit and what integrations and context they use.
There you mentioned one very interesting part around you are assuming that the context windows will keep getting larger and also the effective context windows. Like one of the things that, as I understand, Factory excels at is like managing very large code bases. Do you think the value of Factory gets diminished as effective context windows gets larger, or it gets amplified, or how do you think around this?
No, this is a great question, and it's something we think about a lot is what does larger context look like? How does that impact different decisions we've made in the product? I think the short answer is longer context will strictly make Factory more interesting, more unique, more capable. And a lot of what we've done is actually build a system that doesn't just fit the context into the window, but also prioritizes it. I think that there's sort of a loose assumption with these growing context windows that there's a information theory backed problem of just fitting all of the info at once. There's just a limit to how much sort of like reasoning that can happen in a reasonable amount of time over very long context. And so it's going to continue to be the case that things like heuristics, strategies for prioritization, re-ranking are going to, for at least the next couple of years, still be valuable. One thing that I think is interesting about longer context and fitting more code bases, for example, is that when we talk to folks who are at the labs, I was with somebody at one of the frontier labs who actually basically shipped their long context model. And they were saying when you actually evaluate sort of like the very complex reasoning chains, the effective context window falls not to like 50, but like to 10,000 tokens. So we're still in this world where very long context and effective reasoning, or at least the same level of reasoning that happens over like small questions and like immediate back and forths or writing is still pretty far. It's very achievable though. We will definitely have 10 million and even 100 million token context models. But I do think that it'll continue to be that an effective question, the right info into a very long context model will always be better than just fully stuffing it with info.
No, and I largely agree. And I know DeepMind did a podcast where they share that they apparently know how to get to 10 million context windows, but whether that's it's like the amount of money they have to spend to get there at this time, it's not worth it. So there are many things in that equation. And as you think about one of the key elements or key factors for Factory is providing the right context to the agent, how are you finding the general level of readiness among the enterprises for this agent development future? And what I mean is like, how good is their documentation? Specifically, seeing a lot of this documentation in the past has been seen like as overhead.
Yeah, I think that there's actually a pretty funny sort of bimodal distribution that we see. As you are early stage, there's a lot of people who are ready. They're like, let's deep dive into this future. That's kind of obvious. I think people sort of intuitively know that smaller early stage companies are much faster adopters of new technology. Where we actually see the slump is in the sort of like very broad and large mid-market, where a lot of companies that you'd think of as being pretty frontier are experimenting. They get the AI IDE and they say, okay, we're good. And then there's in the enterprise a huge then spike or a resurgence of really sort of like kind of getting it, where they are thinking, yes, we know that AI IDEs are helpful. We know autocomplete is helpful, but we're trying to go to 10x, not 20% or 30%. And that 10x they know comes from a workflow change, not just a like procuring yet another tool, right? And so we see a lot of buy-in, at least from the organization and from the leaders and from the developers as well. I think a lot of people are ready. They're down to pick up a frontier tool and really like learn a new way to work. I think that with respect to documentation and use of Jira, definitely there's a lot of work to be done in getting a enterprise ready to use tools like this. There are fragmented code bases, there's legacy code. Most of the docs are completely out of date and effectively irrelevant. Part of what we do that goes beyond just taking context and putting it into our models is also parsing and figuring out what information is relevant. Is this information important? And doing that proactively. So a lot of us of the assumptions we have is that your org is going to have like outdated docs, totally incorrect information, repos that are out of date, code that's broken. And so we build those assumptions into the product experience so that the agent can navigate properly.
And as it relates to this, if there was a CTO or VP of engineering at a large enterprise hearing this, what would be like one or two very tactical, practical things that you would advise them to start doing as they start preparing their work towards like this agent development future?
I could do a whole 30-minute spiel on this, but I think the two like very tactical, immediate ROI things. One is everyone in your org should be transcribing every single meeting they have. You need to really be bringing this like physical and video-based communication that happens every single day at your company and bring that into a consumable data format. That is definitely the biggest tactical change that you can make tomorrow. That would be huge ROI for future agentic tools. The second is, I think, establishing a sort of process by which your team documents and plans engineering and product decisions and also writes out those decisions is so critical. You should really not see PRDs and ADOs and engineering design docs as like labor, but instead as the almost like the ground truth document that outlines what you're trying to do, because agents and in particular droids are able to pick up on those design docs, those patterns, and turn those into working code. And I think we're going to see in general a shift as we like agent driven development will bring a lot of spec driven practices into the org. And so if your team doesn't have these and there isn't a top down sort of this is how we're going to build, then you're going to start seeing all of the individual teams at your company trying to make this process in real time. And that's going to lead to fragmentation. And ultimately, it's going to be a whole pain to refactor way later.
No, alignment is the key thing. And yeah, I think every industry and beyond coding should start recording a lot of the things they do on a daily basis. One of the things I also wanted to get your take is, in general, one of the challenges I see with the agents is how you balance the flexibility that LLMs bring, like their non-probabilistic nature with the pluses that brings, but at the same time balancing with their maybe rigidity that's needed to create a reliable process, especially as you think about application of agents in a enterprise setting.
Yeah, I think that almost like the name of the game when you're building an agent product is, what is your validation technique? What is your strategy for validating these non-deterministic fuzzy outputs and systems? And ultimately, this ties to evaluation of your product and your own experience, right? It's kind of like Goodhart's law. You become what you measure, right? And your agents certainly become what you evaluate. And a lot of what is required for, at least in the software development space, I think this is probably why agents have seen the most success in software, there are a ton of ways that you can validate the outcomes. With respect to the more obvious, like code, you have all these signals like tests and linters and syntax, so like language servers. You have code review. You have the ability to measure like commits and code generated. And you can take all of this and actually turn that into meaningful signal, both in real world environments as well as in simulated environments, right? So a lot of the work being done is this sort of non-gradient based learning for your product where you make a bunch of tweaks, you run some evaluations, it looks promising, you ship it to the real world, you measure that impact, then you say, okay, this assumption was correct, but this one was not. Let's build a new hypothesis and ship a new thing. And so that sort of loop is pretty integral to building an agent. When you move towards the fuzzier world, like how do we know that our ADRs or our PRDs that we generate are high quality? That's where you can start to get a little bit more creative and say, well, maybe we use taste and we use sort of like rubrics and LLM as judge when we want to eval offline. But then in the real world, we look and analyze, certain scenarios, or, if you have a version of your product that you can ship to people who are willing to share feedback, right? Then you can look towards those and say, hey, what's working, what's not, and use that and bring LLMs, like LLM as a judge based techniques to do that at more than human scale.
No, I agree. I'm fair believer of the phrase as well. Like, yeah, you cannot improve what you don't measure, especially in this space. One part that I wanted to ask you about is what's your take on the current coding benchmarks? Do you think they correctly capture where factory excels, or which new benchmarks and new kind of capabilities do you think it's lacking on the existing benchmarks?
This was something that was really important to us early on as we worked towards defining evaluations, metrics, and the capabilities of our agent. When we, our first attempts to build like a proper coding agent, we topped the leaderboard in Swebench and beat out a bunch of we beat Amazon and Alibaba and Devin and basically everybody. And then I think doing that exercise made us quickly realize how completely different these sorts of benchmarks are from the real world, where most things like Swebench, for example, are extremely targeted exercises looking at Python. There's now a bunch more now. Like I think there's validated versions of Swebench. There's more broad, diverse coding benchmarks that look at, I'd say, a little bit better of a real world slice. But I think the thing that's hard to capture in these automated benchmarks is the sort of like back and forth that happens in real world environments and the diversity of those real world environments that your agent encounters. So an example of this is if you have an agent that is going to interact with a person in Slack to kick off a conversation, and then they're going to move in to the web only if it encounters a challenge, and then it's going to basically flip the way that the human interacts with the agent. It's really hard to sort of simulate or build that sort of eval. So instead, I think where these sort of automated offline evals excel are looking at very specific tasks, like the ability to write code really quickly or patching code on, a data set of the top 30 languages. So we have a lot of these like offline evals that are basically built to focus on specific tasks that our agent are going to do, and especially the sort of subtasks that the agent encounters. When we think about that top level agent loop, that's when you have to get fuzzier sorts of evals. And for that, we've really had to build our own set of sort of like real world example driven evaluations. And those we find to be incredibly helpful. And then, of course, when we ship changes, we have an anonymized way of evaluating the impact of success on our customers. And so we use that as well.
No, that's a great take and approach there to the benchmarks. One part I wanted to ask you about was talent. Has the process of hiring changed, especially for software engineers, since you started Factory to in the early days to how you do the process today? Or is there like one key thing that you have learned during this process of hiring now over 30 people that you have of a team of skills that you think it's particularly more important today than it was ever before?
Yeah, I love talking about our team because it's the thing that gets me out of bed every morning. It's so energizing to enter into a space where you're surrounded by just the most talented people. And I think that the one thing that hasn't changed is we've just continued to, raise the bar as time has gone on. And I think probably the biggest differentiator between someone who makes it and doesn't is everybody here is incredibly passionate about our goal. And you can really feel that when someone walks in the room and they know about everything in this space. They're obsessed with a sub problem that they've encountered. They've worked on something like it. They experiment with them in their free time. Like, people here are obsessed with the idea of making humans better at building software, right? And giving humans the opportunity to build 10x 100x better software. And so I think that that's something that you really feel and has remained totally unchanged since the beginning. Maybe a couple things that have sort of evolved over time. We initially were looking at a lot of folks. I think it was sort of like this like golden unicorn filter if you had actually worked on an agent before. Now a lot of people have worked on agents, and that's great because it means that we have a lot more sort of uh, different domains, but ultimately the same sort of skill sets, where people understand what it means to work with LLMs. They've probably touched or used LLMs before. I think that the persona has changed a lot. Like, we're still looking for research engineers and back end, but also like front end engineers has become a big, like, as we have looked towards innovating on UX and really trying to redefine the interaction pattern, really solid like design engineers, front end engineers has become very top of mind for us. And also our go-to-market motion has expanded. We're looking at folks who are customer engineers, forward deployed engineers, sales. And I think that that has been really exciting to sort of expand the breadth of personas. But when I think about talent density, that's basically on my mind. It's arguably what I spend 30 to 50% of my time doing. Is just really trying to make sure that we're curating a group of people that care deeply, that have great tastes. And I think there's something else that I could talk about. I'm not sure if we want to go there, which is just like how the roles of individuals are blending together.
Yeah, I would love to.
Yeah, like 2.5 years ago, I think that, we really were like, okay, infra engineers, backend engineers, full stack engineers. I think that working on Factory and using tools like Factory really show you that that's a distinction that has got like 2 years left max. Like, we're hiring members of technical staff, and they are good at everything, and they have taste, which is extremely important. They have a deep understanding of the product and empathy towards developers. And they definitely have some deep experience in at least one field of software development. But our research engineers ship infra and front end code in the same week. Our folks that we hired as like infra engineers, right, or that was their background coming in, are working on, LLMs. They're working on Kubernetes. They're talking to customers. Like, there's really just such a blending of personality and role that occurs because you have droids that can really work at, like, you don't know how this one technology works. Okay, talk to a droid about it for about an hour, and then you'll understand it, at least in the depth needed to ship something high quality. And I think that has definitely, we see that as well on the non-technical roles, right? Our ops folks use Factory, our sales and our forward deployed engineers and our customer folks, they all use Factory in their day-to-day. So I think that there's just sort of like a blending that's happening where being technical is almost sort of like a short-lived distinction.
Apart from blending, one of the part that I was curious if you're already starting to see is kind of getting in a software engineer role, somebody who necessarily doesn't come from like a very highly technical background. And if you are having even people like that in Factory, or you think that's going to happen in a near future, and not just like, again, in an ops role, but like actually having like somebody engineer person, but not necessarily someone that did like a full CS engineer background.
Yeah, I think that is there's no, like, in our hiring process, two things that I was really adamant about is, one is like university or college, I think, is like effectively like irrelevant unless someone's like lying about it. I think look at their roles, look at their background, look at their energy, much better signal. If anything, there's sometimes anti-signal in like really prestigious schools, people who kind of come in, they got jobs because their school's got a good pipeline, but they're actually not top talent. And then the other thing is making sure that we measure like technical bar, not but like CS major, non-CS major, like we're still going to assess you for your technical skills, but even our interview process allows you to use AI. And so if you are skilled at problem solving and you understand how to use the best AI tools, now I will say, we've actually had one person who was not we've only had one person do this, but there was somebody who came in, background was finance, never been a professional software engineer. And they still have, I think, like the third highest interview score that we've ever given anybody on technicals. Like they absolutely crushed the technicals, right? For many reasons, they actually ended up not being a good fit. But I think that like that's so possible. And I would imagine that that will only increase as people integrate AI into the interview loop, and like the technical skills that you assess are less like, do you know how to reverse a linked list, but rather you understand how to deeply solve problems and leverage tools to do that.
No,
Yeah.
I absolutely love that framework. From what I've learned, like from the external side is like your first kind of year was a lot of focus on building, especially given that you target enterprise. It had to be like a very robust platform. Now it seems that you're moving towards the more scaling phase of user acquisition. What have been some of the main learnings so far on selling and go-to-market strategies to the enterprises on this space?
Yeah, I mean, so many. I think, you go into a space like this and you are, I mean, in many ways, in the agent space in general, there's a lot of laying the tracks in front of you as you sort of, drive the train, because a lot of people just don't think about the next 2 to 5 years and what that really means. And you kind of have to be the one to say, hey, look at this technology. Look at where it was just 6 months ago. What's your plan? Because 6 months from now, this is what it's going to look like, right? And I think that there's always this blend of what your product looks like now, what your vision is, what it used to look like, and why it's insane that it's moved so quickly. So, I mean, maybe concrete learnings. I think that focusing on security and reliability is just so important. I think that people want a trustworthy name in this space. They don't want somebody who got famous because like they're a consumer product. They want somebody who's actually focused on enterprise environments and empathizing with the difference between a solo dev and a large enterprise. I think that's a big one. I think honesty goes a long way, right? Like if you come into the software development space and you say, look, here's our product, it actually can replace your software engineers, I think it's just disingenuous, and it leads to people having sort of like a bad taste in their mouth. And I think it's also kind of not what our industry is moving towards. It feels to me like although like a background in CS is not necessarily going to be important, being somebody who does deeply understand the technology, that is only going to continue to be important. Now you can pick up that understanding now incredibly quickly. So the bar of like, or rather not the bar, but rather the barriers to entry have fallen, but the bar is like getting raised, so to speak. And so I think that what that tells me is that we're at the point with the least amount of software developers in history. We're only going to have more. And so if you try to like kind of sell that vision because it's a quick win for like a CTO to say, look, we've reduced spend this much, I think that's a bit disingenuous. I think you just have to be really persistent. Basically, you are the one it's everything for you. It's basically kind of like yet another email for all of the buyers. And even the most passionate people will still forget to like open an email. And so it's like best to be like pretty thick skinned. Like we've had effectively every single company that has ever rejected us that we cared about has come back to us and said, actually, okay, let's give it a try now. And I think that goes to show that people care about this industry. People care about this technology. And just because it's not the right time now in this space, wait 2 weeks and a year's passed. So just give it another go,
No, and I can validate how close you are to your customer. Though I'm not your ideal customer base. I registered for this podcast and I quickly got an email from Matan asking for feedback and how had my experience been. One of the last few questions I had is if I were a CTO of a large enterprise and I came to Factory and I said, I'm fully bought in the agentic development future and I want to automate and delegate to the droids as much as possible. If you tell me I can delegate everything, I would today. What are some of the things that still you wouldn't be able to do?
I think that the biggest area that feels really untapped for us right now is the sort of like broader observability and deployment and infrastructure space. Like really the moment that you get to reading an AWS CloudWatch log in order to like switch an EC2 instance on or off, I think you just get into this space that feels really risky. And I think that the room for error there, funny enough, I actually think that we're fairly close to human error, sort of almost like outpacing agent error in a lot of ways. And like human plus agent together, I think almost certainly is more effective, better, like you'll have less errors. So which is why we recommend our reliability droid, right? Can surface up to you from a Sentry error or a CloudWatch error or something like that. It can surface up to you an incident response plan or remediation. But what we won't do is we won't go and run that full remediation unless it's a code change with like a PR review process. And so it feels to me like everything touching like reliability, SRE style work is still in this like sort of like earlier stage in general that is riskier. And so a lot of people want to stay away from that. So I think that that's one big domain that is obviously going to be a huge unlock. We're working on a lot of things to this end that we'll be releasing over the next like month or two. But I think that once we really dove deep into that problem, I think it gave us a lot of appreciation for like risk levels that different engineering leaders have. So I think that's probably the biggest. Still feels like very large migrations are a very much human in the loop process, but we think you can still do that way faster. We've seen people take a 30-day, 60-day thing and turn it into like a one-day project inside a factory. Fully automating that at scale is nowhere near happening. And I think it will only happen when there's a couple more fundamental leaps in model capability.
And it's interesting on that error comment that you made. Also, the human psychology plays a role around like even if you have like on par or even superior error rates. Like I feel like sometimes we judge the AI harder than we judge humans. So that's another element. But not to finish, I would like to do like two very quick fire round questions. Basically, I give you two quick questions and you give me your immediate answers.
Sure, let's do it.
What percentage of code inside factories generated using Droids?
This is funny. We just started, we just finished the final measurement of this. In the past, it's been like 70, 80%, but I can confirm that we've Theseus shipped ourselves. So it's now effectively like 90% of the code is completely AI generated. 10% is surely layered on top of others, but we can't actually track that. Pretty soon we'll have a tool to help you track that too.
Oh, wow, that's pretty high. I think it's the highest I've personally heard on internally. So congratulations. And the last one was what is one publicly listed company that you would buy and one that you would short based on the impact that you think generative would have on that public company?
Oh, that's a great question. In terms of short, I think it would be NVIDIA. Funny enough, I think that there is a clear sort of, I wouldn't say it's the impact of generative AI, but it's more of like the dynamics. I think that Google and Amazon and Microsoft all saw how NVIDIA was kind of king making. You get these H100s and you get these H100s and have now really accelerated their own internal chip efforts. And, you know, they have, each of them has their own foundation model lab that they stay close to in order to understand what those requirements are. And so I'm kind of bearish on the long-term success of NVIDIA compared to the very large, you know, the FANG companies kind of taking over. In terms of one company that I would buy, I think right now Apple is really undervalued with respect to AI because they haven't made
That's a hot take.
right now they have not made a play, and I think that they failed to make a play. So I think that basically means that they're at like the lowest possible like faith estimate of how they're going to enter AI. Really the only company that can build a like Jarvis or like a real like true personal assistant is going to be Apple. I do think that they will do that. They're just not there yet. And so give them a year or two, let them use Anthropic for a year to play catch up, and then have them, you know, do what Zuck's doing and buy a bunch of research engineers. And I think they'll probably catch up pretty quickly.
Hopefully they get it right soon. I've been postponing by my iPhone, hoping that the next generation is the one that's like has true AI intelligence. But no, you know, I highly appreciate the time. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, this has been amazing. Thank you so much.